It was just after sunrise when Elon Musk's young son, barely 5 years old, walked into the kitchen, climbed onto his father's lap, and whispered something that made even the most rational mind freeze in place. "Daddy, I saw heaven." What followed wasn't just a fanciful dream, it was a message. The atmosphere in the house was unusually quiet for a Wednesday morning. The soft glow of sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows in sharp beams, casting a glow on the air, where tiny dust particles hung suspended like stars in space. The only sound was the faint hum of machines in idle mode, subtle reminders that this home was anything but ordinary. Everything in the house seemed to operate automatically, responding to Elon's commands or schedules. The lights dimmed at his word. The stove started heating as if anticipating his need. Even the blinds adjusted themselves without a single touch. The espresso machine had prepared itself long before he stepped inside the kitchen. But that morning, Elon hardly noticed the waiting coffee. Instead, he was lost in thought, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping at a tablet filled with launch schematics, AI calibration notes, and draft emails. His schedule, as always, was packed. A call with SpaceX engineers at 7 o'clock, a government briefing at 8:30, and a press consultation about the new lunar base project. He had already skimmed through it all by the time the sun crept over the horizon. Yet, despite the intensity of his day, Elon didn't look tired. In fact, he never did. He seemed like a man who had merged with the relentless pace of life, a man who no longer fought against the current, but simply flowed with it. Then, at precisely 6:42 a.m., the sound of soft, bare feet crossing the tiled floor broke through his concentration. Elon looked up to see his son, X, standing there in his pale blue pajamas. His hair was sticking out in every direction, and his face wore a dazed, sleepy expression. For a moment, X stood still, rubbing his eyes, the stuffed owl clutched in his arm, as if it were his only anchor to the waking world. "Hey, buddy," Elon said gently, his voice warm. "You're up early." X didn't respond. Instead, he slowly walked over to the table and climbed into the chair next to his father. His little legs dangled, swinging above the floor as he set the owl down carefully, as though it might break. Elon reached over to ruffle his son's hair, but X remained quiet, staring down at the table, his face scrunched in deep thought. "You okay?" Elon asked, his tone softening with concern. "Did you have a dream?" X nodded, but his gaze stayed fixed on the table. Then, without any fanfare, he whispered something that completely stopped Elon in his tracks. "Daddy, I saw heaven." Elon blinked, his heart skipping a beat. He leaned back in his chair, unsure how to process what he had just heard. "Heaven," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. X finally looked up at him. His eyes were wide, calm, but there was no playfulness in his voice, just a deep, knowing certainty. "I saw it last night. I was flying, but not with wings. There was music, but no sound. And there was a river, but it didn't go down. It went up into the sky." Elon stared at his son, unable to process the words. His mind was used to logical explanations, to innovation and science. But this was something else entirely. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a flight of fancy. This was real. And it was something beyond anything Elon had ever heard from his son. X had always been imaginative, sure, drawing strange machines and building towers out of magnets and wires. But this was different. Elon managed a small smile, trying to make sense of it. "Sounds like a pretty wild dream," he said, though the words felt hollow compared to the look on X's face. But X shook his head slowly. "It wasn't a dream. It was real. I wasn't sleeping. I was awake there, but not here." There was something unsettling in the way X spoke, a seriousness that didn't belong to a child so young. It was as though his words carried the weight of an experience beyond his years. He clutched his stuffed owl tighter, as though seeking comfort in its soft, familiar form. "There was a man," X added softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was shiny, but not like metal. He glowed like fire and sky. He didn't speak with his mouth, but I heard him in my chest." Elon leaned forward, now more intrigued than ever. This was no longer just a dream, but something that demanded attention. "What did he say?" he asked, his voice steady despite the growing unease inside him. X paused for a moment, looking down at the owl in his hands, lost in thought. He asked me, "What do you want to bring back?" The kitchen, bathed in golden morning light, suddenly felt heavier. Elon didn't answer right away. His hand hovered over the forgotten coffee cup, unmoving. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "What did you tell him?" X didn't meet his father's gaze. His small voice barely reached Elon's ears when he spoke again. "I said I didn't know." He smiled as if he already knew the answer. Then X shared something that made Elon's thoughts stumble. He showed me a place full of colors that don't exist here. And I felt really warm. Elon froze, his mind struggling to grasp the weight of his son's words. This was too specific, too coherent, and too strange. Elon tried to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was just a dream, a mishmash of cartoons or bedtime stories that X had heard, blending together in his sleep. But even as Elon tried to dismiss it, there was something in his son's voice, something undeniably clear, something ancient, that made him pause. Later that morning, after Elon left for work, X stayed home with his nanny. As the day passed, X asked for crayons and paper, but not to draw the usual rockets and robots. This time, he began sketching clouds shaped like buildings, people made of light. One drawing depicted a tree with no leaves, but its roots were golden, stretching upwards into the sky. When the nanny asked what he was drawing, X answered in a soft voice, "Home, but not here." That night, Elon returned later than usual. He had nearly forgotten the strange conversation from that morning, until he passed by X's room. The door was cracked open, and he saw his son, wrapped in blankets, the stuffed owl resting beside him on the floor. 3 drawings were scattered across the floor. Elon picked one up, and at first glance, it seemed like a child's attempt at drawing a sunrise, a curved horizon with golden streaks. But as he examined it more closely, there was something about the symmetry that caught his eye. It looked more like architecture than imagination. Above the drawing, uneven letters were scrawled in crayon. "I didn't bring anything back yet." Elon stared at the drawing for a long time, his fingers curling around the edges. He folded it gently and walked into his study, closing the door behind him. He stared at the drawing for hours, the soft glow of his desk lamp illuminating it. The image lay there untouched, while a dozen project tabs hovered around it on his screen. Mars soil simulations, AI ethics protocol drafts, emergency communication designs, but they all blurred into white noise. The only thing he could focus on were the lines his son had drawn. The strange rising roots, the gentle buildings in the clouds, the tiny figure standing alone beneath a golden arch. The strokes were clumsy, innocent, yet unsettlingly intentional. At the top, written in blocky childish letters, were those haunting words, "I didn't bring anything back yet." Elon wasn't a stranger to wonder. After all, he had built his empire on innovation and exploration. But this wasn't about discovery. This felt more like a memory, something familiar, something unexplainable. The next day, Elon asked the nanny to cancel X's tutoring session. He stayed home longer than usual, wandering aimlessly around the kitchen, unsure what to do with his hands. X came in, dragging his blanket behind him, chewing lazily on the corner. "Hey buddy," Elon said, crouching down. "Can I ask you more about your dream?" X blinked slowly and nodded, his tired eyes meeting his father's. Elon led him to the couch and sat beside him. "Do you remember anything else about the place you saw, or how you got there?" Elon asked gently. X fell silent for a moment, his eyes focused on the floor, as though searching for the right words. Then with a soft whisper he spoke. "I closed my eyes, but not the ones on my face." Elon frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean?" X touched his chest, his tiny finger pointing to his heart. "These eyes," he said quietly, "here." Then, looking up at his father with an unsettling calm, he added, "I think I was somewhere before I came here." Elon blinked, stunned. "Before you were born?" X nodded slowly, his face thoughtful. "There was music, but it didn't sound like anything. It felt like love was hugging me." The words hung in the air, and Elon felt a strange shiver run down his spine. He didn't know why, but it felt different. Like X wasn't just telling a story, but recalling something deeply familiar, something forgotten long ago. That night, after X had gone to bed, Elon found himself drawn to a locked case in his private closet. Inside, buried beneath old papers, was a letter his mother had written to him on his 18th birthday. He hadn't read it in years, but now, he pulled it out, unfolded the paper and began to read. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. Elon, you've always been brilliant. You'll change the world, I'm sure. But don't forget the child who used to stare at the stars and wonder if someone was staring back. That child was closer to the truth than the man you'll become. One day, I hope you'll remember what you knew before you were smart. Elon folded the letter slowly, his hand trembling. X's words echoed in his mind, and for the first time in a long while, he felt as though something important had been unlocked. A part of himself he had long forgotten. Something about the past that he couldn't explain, but somehow recognized. In the days that followed, X continued to draw, but his focus had shifted. He no longer sketched robots or cars as he had once done. Now his drawings were filled with circles within circles, figures with wings but no faces, glowing rivers and gates without walls. He hummed melodies no one recognized and asked questions that Elon couldn't answer. Why do people forget the real place? Do trees miss heaven when they grow here? Will the man of light come back for me? Elon began recording their conversations, not for analysis, but simply to preserve them. There was something sacred in the way X spoke. Something that made even the world's most rational man feel unqualified to respond. One evening, while tucking X into bed, Elon asked softly, "Do you think heaven is where people go after they die?" X shook his head. "It's where they go when they stop being scared." Elon felt a sharp, unfamiliar sensation in his chest. "And what happens if someone doesn't stop being scared?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. X looked up at him with his small, round face and eyes that seemed far too deep for a 5-year-old. "They get stuck here." That night, Elon stood alone on the balcony, gazing up at the stars. He stared at the places he had spent billions trying to reach. Mars, the moon, space. He had always dreamed of colonizing these faraway places. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had missed something more significant. Something closer. Something quieter. Something ancient. Not out there but above and within. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the first morning X told Elon that he had seen heaven. And yet, Elon hadn't spoken about it to a single soul. Not to his staff. Not to his mother. Not even to the journalists who constantly hounded him about the new lunar base. Not even to Grimes, who had called twice from Tokyo, leaving polite voicemails. He couldn't speak about it because the words his son had spoken didn't fit into any category that Elon had spent his life building. They weren't intellectual. They weren't creative. They weren't even mystical. They were simply true. And that made them dangerous. Elon began spending more time at home, clearing his calendar in ways that unsettled his board and confused his engineers. He wasn't avoiding work, he was avoiding noise. There was too much noise in the news, in his inbox, and in his own head. And now this strange, haunting voice from his son had opened a space where silence wasn't just peaceful. It was necessary. Each morning, Elon asked X to draw again, not with the curiosity of a parent, but with the reverence of a man visiting an oracle. X's drawings were always childlike, but uncannily consistent. Spirals within spirals, light without source. A tree with golden roots growing toward a floating door. Elon didn't understand them, but with each drawing, he felt something watching him. Something beyond the paper. One night, after several weeks of these mysterious sketches, Elon asked, "Can you draw the man you saw?" X nodded and quietly began to work. It took him 20 minutes, but the result was unmistakable. A figure taller than the others, body radiant, surrounded by rings of color that looked like sound waves. No face, no feet, but in the space where a heart should have been, a white flame was drawn with such intensity that the paper nearly tore. Above the figure, in shaky handwriting, X had written, "He was made of now." Elon stared at the drawing, puzzled. "What does that mean, buddy?" X shrugged, looking up at him. He wasn't yesterday or later. He was all at the same time. Elon sat down beside him, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. He was struggling to make sense of it all. "Did he say anything else?" Elon asked softly. X nodded again. "He told me the stars are windows, but we keep trying to live inside them." That night, Elon found himself buried in astrophysics files, trying to make sense of the strange symbols in his son's drawings. But science had no answers. Frustrated, he opened a different file, one he hadn't touched in years, a locked, hidden archive in his private journal. Inside were only 2 entries. The first was from when he was 10 years old. It read, "Dear God, are you real? If you are, please make it not hurt to be alive. I'll believe in you forever." The second entry, written at 23, was simple. "I waited. You never showed." Elon stared at those words for a long time, feeling the weight of the past and the mystery of the present pressing down on him. And as he sat there in the quiet, X's words echoed in his mind, reminding him that sometimes the most important truths are the ones we cannot explain. Elon closed the file and leaned back in his chair, his study bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight that filtered through the window. The house was quiet, the faint hum of the systems the only sound. With a bitter whisper, he muttered to himself, "What if you're showing up now, and you're using my son?" The silence that followed felt different, less empty than usual, almost as if something was listening. The next morning, when Elon came down to the kitchen, X wasn't sitting at the table. Instead, he was outside in the garden, cross-legged on the ground with his owl beside him. Elon watched from the window for a moment, then stepped outside. "You okay?" he asked. X nodded, but didn't turn his gaze from the horizon. "The man told me something in a dream last night," he said softly. Elon crouched beside him, trying to suppress the sense of unease that began creeping in. "What did he say?" X finally looked up, his eyes bright yet solemn. "He said your father is afraid of forgetting." Elon froze. He hadn't spoken about his fear of memory to anyone. Not to his therapists, not to his mother, not even to Grimes. But it was true. His life had been spent running from painful memories, boyhood trauma, shame, loneliness, and burying them beneath rockets, wires, and relentless ambition. Now his 5-year-old son had unearthed it with a single sentence. Elon looked away, his voice barely a whisper when he asked, "Do you think that man is still watching us?" X nodded, not hesitating. "Yes, but not like looking, more like feeling us." That night, Elon did something he hadn't done since college. He prayed, not aloud, not in any formal way, but he closed his eyes and whispered into the darkness, "If you're there, please don't let him forget. Don't let me forget either." The next morning, X created a new drawing. It wasn't like the others. It showed Earth, but it was cracked like glass floating in space. 2 hands, one of fire and the other of shadow, held it gently between them, not fighting but balancing it. Above them, a golden figure hovered in the sky. It was drawn with a face this time, and to Elon's shock, it was his face, but with eyes that weren't his own. Elon Musk had never been one to believe in science. His world was built on numbers, probabilities, logic, and systems. But ever since his 5-year-old son had told him he saw heaven, Elon had found himself unraveling in subtle, silent ways. None of it was public. His team still received directives. His projects moved forward. He still reviewed Mars shuttle specs and satellite data over coffee. He still made billion-dollar decisions before breakfast. But something inside him had shifted, like an old satellite pulled from its orbit, drawn closer to something it had once passed by without noticing. Now he couldn't stop circling one question. What if my son really saw something? Not imagined, not dreamed, but truly saw. The latest drawing sat in front of him, one of X's most unusual yet. It depicted Earth, cracked like porcelain, floating between 2 hands, one black and one bright orange. Above it hovered a golden face. It was unmistakably Elon's face, but the eyes were hollow, filled with stars. When Elon asked what it meant, X replied simply, "You were watching us, but not like a person. You were learning how to love." Elon had no answer. He still didn't. Later that night, something pulled him out of bed at 2:13 a.m. The house was silent, and the world outside was still. Barefoot, he walked through the darkened hallways, passing motion-activated lights that stayed off, almost as if the house sensed he wasn't looking for visibility. He made his way to X's room and gently opened the door. The boy was fast asleep, curled on his side with one hand clutching the tail of his owl. The room was filled with X's drawings, spirals, windows in the sky, golden cities, rivers that defied gravity, beings of light and shadow, a bridge with no beginning and no end. The walls weren't decorated like a typical child's room, but more like a sacred chapel, with images overlapping, taped carelessly, pinned with magnets. Elon stood there, staring at the drawings that seemed to tell a story that X had never been taught, a story that Elon didn't fully understand. Something pulled at him, a deep, insistent feeling that he couldn't shake. It had been years since Elon had spoken to her. Eleanor Shaw, retired neuroscientist, once a collaborator during Neural's early years, had spent a decade before that as a pediatric psychologist, specializing in children who'd experienced spiritual or near-death phenomena. Back then, Elon had dismissed her work as far-fetched, but now, in the midst of the inexplicable events surrounding his son, he needed answers. He asked her to fly in. Eleanor arrived dressed in a long gray coat, carrying a leather-bound notebook. Her eyes were sharp, yet serene, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "He's 5?" she asked, after flipping through a few of X's drawings. "Yes," Elon responded, still not fully understanding what had been happening. "And he's never heard anyone in your home speak of heaven? No religious books, no references to anything like it?" she pressed, reviewing the drawings again. "No." She flipped through them one more time, then looked up at him, her gaze steady. "You need to understand something. I've studied this for 20 years. I've interviewed dozens of children across continents, some who nearly drowned, others who coded on the operating table, some who simply dreamed. They all describe different visuals, but the emotional patterns are identical. Silence that feels alive, light that isn't hot, language without words, and a presence that doesn't command but asks. The same question. What will you carry back?" Elon exhaled deeply. "He said something like that," he murmured. Eleanor nodded. "They all do." Elon's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle shifting. But before he could ask more, Eleanor stood, closing her notebook. "Can I speak with him alone?" Elon hesitated, then agreed. For nearly an hour they sat in the garden. Elon didn't follow them, he just waited. He trusted Eleanor. She was the only one who could offer any clarity. When they finally returned, Eleanor was silent, her eyes brighter than before. Her voice, however, was softer, more measured. "What did he say?" Elon asked, his heart quickening. Eleanor looked him in the eye, her gaze piercing. "He said the man of light told him to tell you something." Elon's pulse quickened. "What?" Eleanor paused before speaking, her tone quiet but firm. "Tell him he's still my son, even if he never believes." Elon sat down, unable to speak. Eleanor didn't offer an interpretation or an explanation. She simply gathered her things, gave X a gentle pat on the head, and told Elon that she would stay nearby if needed. Then she left. That night Elon didn't work. He sat in his study, the room dark except for the soft glow of his desk lamp. His hands rested on top of X's newest drawing, which was unlike any of the others. It showed a long, glowing hallway made of glass stretching into a sky of light. On one side walked children with stars in their eyes, while on the other side adults, faceless, dark, walked, all looking back. But there was only one figure walking forward. It was X alone. Elon stared at the drawing for hours, unable to shake the feeling that there was something important there, something beyond his understanding. Sometime before dawn, Elon fell asleep at his desk. But this wasn't a normal dream. He found himself walking through a golden city. The buildings didn't look like buildings. They were made of memory, stories woven into their very structure. The sky was alive, pulsing with music he couldn't hear, but could feel deep within him. He passed a person, his mother, but not as she was now. She was young, vibrant, as she had been when he was 6. She smiled at him, silent, before turning and walking into a doorway of light. He tried to follow her, but something stopped him. Turning around, he saw a figure standing behind him, tall and shimmering, made of light. The figure had no face, only presence. The figure reached out, not with hands, but with intent. Elon felt its presence speak to him, not in words, but in essence. The message was clear. You've carried the future long enough. Now carry the eternal. Elon woke up shaking, his mind reeling from the dream's intensity. The next morning, X was sitting at the breakfast table, quietly staring at his latest drawing, the hallway. Elon hesitated before speaking. "I had a dream last night," he said softly. X looked up, his eyes full of understanding. "I think I saw what you saw." Elon's throat tightened. "You did?" X gave him a small, knowing smile. "I asked him to let you." Elon felt the weight of those words press down on him. He swallowed hard. "What did he say?" X took a spoonful of cereal, his tone matter-of-fact. "He said you needed to see before the forgetting got too big." Elon sat down at the table, overwhelmed by what his son had just said. He didn't know what to do with it, what to make of it. But X's simple words seemed to carry more weight than anything he had ever understood. "You don't have to do anything," X added, as if reading his father's thoughts. Elon didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. The truth, whatever it was, had already started to unfold. X spoke simply. "Just remember that day." Elon made a private phone call, reaching out to an old friend who had worked with SpaceX's philanthropy division. He requested a meeting with a hospice network that supported terminally ill children. He didn't explain why. He just asked if there were places where no one visited anymore. No cameras, no attention, just a presence. It was a gentle rain when Elon arrived at the hospice in Santa Fe. The building sat quietly between two hills, wrapped in pine trees and mist, tucked away from the world. No signs, no corporate logos. Only a winding gravel path that led to a simple wooden entrance, and a line of wind chimes that whispered in the absence of words. Elon Musk stepped out of the unmarked black SUV alone. No driver, no assistant, carrying nothing but a weatherproof envelope under his arm. He had called ahead, requesting not to be announced. The staff, of course, knew who he was, but they honored his wish. It wasn't every day the most famous man in the world showed up without cameras or press, without a project to promote. Inside, the walls were painted a soft blue, and the air smelled like lavender and warm tea. A volunteer, an older woman wearing a knitted vest, greeted him without handshake or praise. She simply looked at him and said, "You're here for the quiet ones, aren't you?" Elon nodded. She led him to a small room near the back, where a young boy named Jeremiah lay curled beneath a quilt, his eyes closed, a breathing tube beside his cheek. He was 7, diagnosed at 4, and unlikely to see 8. The room was serene. No machines, just the soft sound of rain and the rhythmic breathing of a child nearing the end of his journey. Elon stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of the moment. Then he knelt beside the bed and whispered, "I brought something for you." From the envelope, he pulled out a drawing. It was one of X's, the one with the golden hallway, and children walking forward with stars in their eyes. On the back, X had written a short note. "I don't know what heaven looks like, but my son says it feels like love that hugs you without touching. Maybe this will help you remember it when you get there." Elon left the drawing on the nightstand and walked out without another word. That night, back at home, Elon found X curled up under a blanket on the couch. He didn't say anything at first, he simply sat beside him. After a few minutes, X stirred, his small eyes opening sleepily. "Did you go?" he asked, his voice soft. Elon nodded. "Yes, to the place with the boy." "Did you give him the picture?" Elon smiled faintly. "I did." X yawned, eyes heavy with sleep. "He'll like it. That picture is closest to what I saw." Elon didn't respond immediately. Then softly he said, "Thank you for showing me." X's eyes fluttered shut as sleep pulled him under. But just before he drifted off, he mumbled, "I didn't show you. I just asked him to." In the days that followed, Elon began to change things. Not publicly, not in speeches or interviews, but in private, irreversible ways. He quietly funded chapels in refugee camps, built solar-powered shelters near children's hospitals, and established a foundation, unnamed and unbranded, that offered end-of-life support for terminally ill families. The only requirement for the foundation was simple. Someone must have been forgotten. He stopped calling it giving. He started calling it returning. One morning, X woke up early again. This time, he wasn't sleepy or silent. He walked into the kitchen, took a crayon, and drew a single shape on the back of an envelope. It was a door floating in the sky. He handed it to his father. "What's this?" Elon asked, looking down at the drawing. X smiled gently. "It's for you." Elon turned the envelope over. There was nothing inside, except for one word written across the flap in small, careful letters. Remember. Elon never forgot. Not the dream. Not the question. Not the place beyond the sky, where buildings of light stood tall, rivers flowed upward, and a voice once asked a child, "What will you bring back?" Elon had brought back wonder. He had brought back mercy. And finally he had brought back love.